There was something in the way Carrie-Anne Moss watched Keanu Reeves that afternoon that didn't fit the usual rhythms of a film set. It wasn't admiration in the celebrity sense, or even the comfortable familiarity of old colleagues. It was quieter than that, more specific. She stood just outside the light setup for their scene, arms crossed loosely, and the expression on her face carried a kind of attention that made you realize you were watching someone genuinely listen to who another person had become. They were back on a Matrix set after years away from it. Not the original trilogy, but the continuation that no one had quite expected. The crew was smaller now, more intimate, and the energy felt different from the controlled chaos of 20 years earlier. There were fewer studio executives hovering, fewer reporters, just the work and the people who'd lived through it the first time, finding themselves in the strange position of returning to something they thought they'd finished. Keanu was talking to a young stunt coordinator about a sequence they'd been rehearsing. The conversation wasn't loud, but Carrie-Anne could hear it from where she stood because the soundstage had that particular kind of quiet that comes right before everything gets loud. They were still in setup mode, lights being adjusted, marks being taped, the kind of in-between time that doesn't make it into behind-the-scenes footage because nothing dramatic is happening. The stunt coordinator, a woman in her late 20s, was explaining a concern about the timing of a fall. She was precise in her language, professional, but there was something tentative underneath it. Not fear exactly, but the carefulness of someone who knows that speaking up might be received as doubt. She kept using phrases like, "if you're comfortable with," and "we could also try." Keanu listened without interrupting. He didn't nod along in that performative way people sometimes do when they're waiting for their turn to talk. He just stood very still, oriented entirely toward her, and let her finish the whole thought. When she was done, he asked her to show him what she meant, not in a challenging way, just an invitation. She walked him through the mechanics, and he followed her movements, mirroring the angles, asking a couple of questions about where his weight should be. Then he tried it at half speed, checked in with her about whether that's what she meant, and when she confirmed, he said, "That's better. Let's do it that way." There was no discussion about whose idea it was, no credit to be distributed, just an easy agreement that they'd found a better option, and now they'd use it. The stunt coordinator's shoulders visibly relaxed, not because Keanu had complimented her, but because he'd simply absorbed what she said and acted on it without ceremony. This was what Carrie-Anne was watching. Not the exchange itself, maybe, but the quality of how he moved through it. When he turned to walk back toward his mark, he caught her eye and gave a small smile, the kind that's more about acknowledging a shared presence than communicating anything specific. She smiled back, and for a second it looked like she might say something. But she didn't. She just kept watching him with that same expression, and now there was something almost fond in it, but also a kind of recognition. Like she was seeing something confirmed that she'd suspected for a long time. A production assistant came by with water bottles, and Carrie-Anne took one, still standing in the same spot. Another actor from the scene, someone newer to the franchise, wandered over and made a comment about how surreal it must be to be back. Carrie-Anne agreed, but her answer was distracted, warm but elsewhere. The newer actor, perhaps sensing he'd interrupted a thought, drifted away politely. Carrie-Anne took a sip of water and moved a little closer to where the next setup was being lit. Keanu was now talking to Lana Wachowski, the director, about something on a monitor. Their conversation had the shorthand of people who'd worked together long enough that full sentences weren't always necessary. Lana gestured at something on the screen. Keanu leaned in, nodded, said something brief, and Lana laughed. It was such an ordinary moment, the kind that happens hundreds of times a day on any set. But there was an ease to it that spoke to years of mutual trust, and Carrie-Anne watched that too. Someone called for final touches, and the energy on set shifted into preparation mode. Carrie-Anne moved toward her position, and Keanu walked over to his. They'd be in this next scene together, a quieter moment in the story where their characters reconnect after a long separation. The blocking had them sitting across from each other, close enough to keep the frame intimate. As they settled into place, there was a brief pocket of time while the camera team made a last adjustment. Keanu glanced at Carrie-Anne and said something about how weird it was that the chairs they were sitting in were more comfortable than the ones from the original films. She laughed, a real laugh, and said something back about how everything hurts more now, so maybe they'd just gotten smarter. He smiled at that, and there was a flicker of shared acknowledgement about age, about time, about the strange fact of their bodies being older while they played characters who existed outside normal aging. It wasn't a sad exchange, just true. Then Lana called for quiet, and they both shifted without any visible effort into character space. The shift was so subtle that if you weren't paying attention, you might not have noticed it happen. But it was there. A change in the quality of their attention, a narrowing of focus. The scene began. It was a dialogue scene, intimate and sparse, and the words themselves were less important than what was underneath them. The script was about reunion, about two people finding each other again after believing it might not be possible. But what came through in the way Keanu and Carrie-Anne played, it wasn't just the fiction of their characters. There was something real threading through it, a genuine tenderness born from years of actual history. When Keanu delivered a line about having thought he'd lost his way, there was a softness in his voice that didn't sound like acting. It sounded like someone speaking carefully about something that mattered. Carrie-Anne listened in character, but also as herself, and her response carried a weight that seemed to acknowledge both the story they were telling and the one they'd lived. Lana let the scene run longer than the scripted length just to see where it would go. Neither actor rushed. They sat with the silences, let the pauses mean something. When Lana finally called cut, there was a beat where neither Keanu nor Carrie-Anne moved. They stayed in the moment for just a second longer, and then Carrie-Anne reached across and squeezed his hand briefly before standing. He squeezed back. It was quick, almost invisible, and no one commented on it. But it was there. The crew reset for another angle, and in the shuffle, Carrie-Anne ended up near the monitors with Lana. They watched the playback together, and at one point Lana said something about how good the scene felt. Carrie-Anne agreed, but then she said, quieter, "He's the same, you know, after all of it. He's the same." Lana looked at her, and there was a shared understanding in the look. They both knew what all of it meant, the fame that had grown to bizarre proportions, the personal tragedies that had become public knowledge, the years of being turned into a meme, an icon, a projection screen for whatever the internet needed him to be. And somehow, underneath all of that, the person they'd worked with in 1999 was still recognizable. Lana nodded. "Yeah," she said, "he is." Carrie-Anne watched the monitor as they queued up the take again. On screen, Keanu's face in close-up carried an openness that seemed almost vulnerable. It was the kind of performance you couldn't fake, the kind that required actually feeling something. "He listens," Carrie-Anne said almost to herself. "Really listens, it's rare." And it was such a simple observation, but it landed with the weight of something important. Because in an industry built on ego and noise and the constant fight for space and recognition, the ability to actually listen, to make room for someone else's idea or concern or truth, was more than rare. It was radical in its quiet way. The rest of the afternoon unfolded in the usual rhythms of production. More takes, adjustments, small conversations between setups. At one point, Keanu sat on an equipment case during a lighting change and ended up talking to one of the grips about motorcycles. The grip was showing him something on his phone, photos of a bike he was restoring, and Keanu asked questions that suggested he actually knew what he was talking about. Not showing off, just engaged. Carrie-Anne, waiting nearby for the next shot, watched that interaction too. And again, there was that look, that quiet attention. Near the end of the day, as they were wrapping, she and Keanu walked off set together, peeling off the small microphones they'd been wearing, rolling their shoulders after hours of controlled stillness. They talked about dinner plans with some of the crew, about whether the weather would hold for an exterior shoot later in the week. Normal things. But then, as they reached the edge of the soundstage, Carrie-Anne stopped and turned to him. "Can I tell you something?" she said. Keanu stopped too, giving her his full attention in that way he had. "Of course." "I wasn't sure about coming back," she said. "To this, I wasn't sure if it would feel right or if we'd be trying to recapture something that was gone." He nodded slowly, not rushing her. "But watching you work," she continued, "watching how you are with people, it reminded me why the first ones mattered. Not the spectacle, the people." Keanu's expression didn't change dramatically, but something softened around his eyes. "I feel the same," he said, "about you, about this." There was a pause, comfortable and full. "You're a good person," Carrie-Anne said, and the way she said it, it was clear she didn't mean it as a compliment in the casual sense. She meant it as an observation of fact, a thing she'd verified over time and found to be consistently true. Keanu looked almost embarrassed, in that way he had when sincerity got too direct. "I try," he said. "We all try." "No," Carrie-Anne said gently, "not like you do." And she left it there, not pushing it further, not making it into a bigger moment than it needed to be. She just let it exist as a true thing she wanted him to know. They walked on together toward the production trailers, the conversation shifting to something lighter, but the feeling of what had been said stayed in the air between them. Respect. Genuine, earned, and mutual. Later, much later, someone on the crew would mention seeing them walk off together that evening, and they'd comment on how easy they seemed with each other, how there was no pretense, and someone else would say that's just how Keanu was with everyone, and they'd be right. But they'd also be missing the specific thing that Carrie-Anne had seen and recognized. It wasn't just kindness, though he was kind. It wasn't just professionalism, though he was that too. It was something about the consistency of his presence. The way he showed up as the same person whether the camera was on or off. Whether he was talking to a director or a day player or someone restoring a motorcycle. In a world that constantly rewarded performance, he'd somehow remained actual. And for someone like Carrie-Anne, who'd navigated the same industry, survived its pressures and illusions, witnessed its casual cruelties, that consistency meant something. It was proof that you could move through all of it and still remain yourself. Still treat people like people. Still listen when someone speaks. The way she looked at him that day wasn't about admiration in the abstract. It was about respect for the specific, difficult work of staying human when everything around you is designed to turn you into something else. And maybe, in some quiet way, it was also about gratitude, for the reminder that it was possible, that after 20 years and all the noise and all the change, the things that mattered most could still be recognized in a glance, a gesture, the quality of someone's attention when you spoke. Pure respect, not given easily, but given fully when earned.